Hello class, I hope you all had a wonderful week. This week we are going to explore surf and turf, and that is animals that we eat. We are going to explore muscle fibers and how they are different in different types of animals, what makes them behave in certain ways, and how they differ from land animals and aquatic animals. So to begin with, we are going to deal a lot with proteins in this lecture. So let's just do a quick refresher. Proteins are super huge molecules. They start off in their natural state, which is kind of folded over. And as anything is applied to them, like heat, change in temperature, change in pH, they're going to begin to open up and expand. They will denature, coagulate, forming a solid mass, which is a non-reversible state, and then they will curdle, expelling all water, fat, becoming tight ball chains. So let's jump right into it. Now, plants were the popular food choice for humans originally, but as climate changes reduced plant growth, people began to taste meat from dead animals. And this allowed them to have higher quantity of proteins and energy than just a plant-based diet at that time. And it also allowed us to evolve larger brains. And because of its preservation methods, which you'll read about, this also allowed us to travel further and move across the world. Now, meat fibers are made of muscle. So most of the time when we're talking about eating meat, we're talking about these muscle fibers, and they're going to be made of different components. So they look a little bit like a rope, and there is an actin and myosin, which are these fiber filaments in the muscle fiber. And what they do is they react with each other, and they pull. So one will pull, and this causes a contraction, which allows the muscle to move. So the myosin head walks along the actin filament, which brings these two actin filaments closer together, shortening the muscle. In order to do this, you have to have ATP, which is going to cause the relaxation. So contraction occurs at will, and your ITP, or adenine triphosphate, is spent, and then your ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, must be used in order to relax the muscle. There's a great image of that, and I've got that right here. And this is where you can actually see the muscle fibers moving across that myosin filament and the actin myofilament as it pulls them almost like a rower and allows the muscle to contract. Now, when we're talking about meat fibers, the direction of the bundles of the meat fibers is what gives meat its texture. So it gives it its bite, and it can be either chewy or tender depending on how meat is sliced. So it's very important that when you are slicing meat, you want to slice meat against the grain. You want to make sure that you are slicing against those ropes. Otherwise, you're going to have a very chewy and not tender bite. Now, an animal's lifestyle will also determine some of the texture of the meat. So when we talk about white meat versus red meat, what are some of the differences between white meat and red meat? So white meat being like chicken meat, or chicken breast, or pork, and then red meat being like the legs of the chicken or beef. What are some of the differences that you've noticed between white meat and red meat, if you eat meat? Yeah, so red meat tends to be a lot juicier. It has more fat in it. It also has more ability to absorb oxygen, because this is the part of the animal that receives frequent exercise. Whereas white meat gets occasional burst of exercise and isn't used frequently, so it's not needing as much of that oxygen carrying hemoglobin, which cause it to have a darker color. So the thicker the muscle cells mean that they get a lot of exercise. And because of that, they're going to have a more reddish or darker color appearance in the actual meat. Now, the white muscle fiber, like the breast of a chicken, it exerts force rapidly and briefly. If you've ever spent time with chickens, you know that they generally don't fly, but when they do, it's usually in response to something that they're trying to run away from. So if a hawk is circling and swoops down to attack, the chickens may fly a very short distance very quickly, and they're using their pectoral or their breast muscles in order to do that, which is why those fast twitch muscles have a white color to them. And because of that, they use glycogen, which enzymes convert into energy. And this produces energy faster than the aerobic cellular respiration that is used with oxygen. But in this process, lactic acid is produced, which can build up and cause some soreness if they're used too frequently. Now let's talk about these red muscle fibers. What makes the red muscle fiber have that red color? Is it blood? Is it, what's causing it to look like that? Well, the myoglobin is an enzyme that grabs the oxygen from the blood, but in the middle of the myoglobin, which is a protein, there is an iron. And this iron, Fe2, is going to attract the oxygen and gives it the red color. As it oxidizes, it will begin to turn brown. So as it's exposed to the air, it will turn a different color if it's exposed, or if the protein is squeezing and it becomes exposed in that way. So you can see meat is determined by the interaction between iron and oxygen. And this leads to the change of color of meat. So if you've ever had a hamburger and gone to the supermarket and seen like the raw hamburger meat, and the outside might have been a little brown, but the inside was still red, if you bought it anyway and took it home and you opened up the package and you noticed that the inside still had a bright red color, but the outside was brown, that's likely due to oxidation or the oxygen getting in there and affecting that iron. So the iron is actually what causes the red color within the meat. Now, as that meat cooks, you may see a pink juice come out of it. Is that blood? Are you seeing blood come out of the meat? You're not. So what that is it's losing its iron. And as the iron is leaving the meat, you're seeing a pink color, and that's what the juice of the meat is. Now, meat also has connective tissue wrapped in it because we need to connect those muscle fibers to the bones. And they're wrapped in protective layers of this glue, right? That holds the meat onto the bones. And these are proteins, mostly collagen, and they strengthen the material. They can also be made of elastins, which are ligaments, also known as the silver skin. But when you heat collagen and break it down, so when this protein is acted on by heat over time, it actually converts into gelatin. And this is great for making broths, for ramen. If you are actually using gelatin to set a gel, such as in the creation of aspic or something like that, you are looking for that collagen from the animal connective tissue, which has then converted into gelatin, and then you use that as a thickener, and we'll talk more about that in our sauces lecture. Now, if you have a really good ramen, when it comes to your table, it's piping hot. And I'm not talking about the kind of ramen that you get at like the supermarket out of the package, but a really high quality piping hot ramen from a real ramen bar. And as it settles, it actually sets into a solid state like Jell-O. And what that is because that bone broth full of the connective tissue and collagen has been cooked for such a long time, the collagen breaks down and it renders into gelatin. And as it cools, it begins to set into a solid mass. So that's why they have to serve it piping hot, so that collagen and gelatin are actually liquefied and you can eat it at that time. Meat also has a lot of fat, lipids, and we are specifically talking here about fat, which means that it's going to be what at room temperature, generally speaking? Fat is what at room temperature? Solid, correct. So we're talking about solid at room temperature, meaning that it's likely a saturated fat. All those carbon chains are filled with hydrogen, stacking them up, making them solid at room temperature. And we store energy in these lipids, and they're distributed between the muscle cells, which gives us the appearance of marbling. So a part of meat that has a high fat marbling content would be something like a Wagyu beef. So true Wagyu beef from Japan is a specific animal. So it is bred for its high fat content. And then it's also treated to a very special diet that I'm sure we all would love of beer and massage. And this animal drinks beer and then is massaged daily so that they have excessive marbling. And you barely cook this meat, just enough to render the fat. It's super buttery and soft. If you're eating Wagyu meat in the United States, chances are you're actually having an Angus Wagyu cross. So it's a crossbreed between an Angus steer and a Wagyu. And it does give you some intense marbling, but not quite as much as if you have a true Japanese Wagyu, which the prices for are insane. Now, one of the reasons that we eat meat as food is because our taste buds recognize that meat is loaded with important nutrients. Now, you can get these nutrients from plant sources, especially with modern technology. We have some great abilities to mimic meat, both in the heme group with that iron in the middle. There is a heme group in a soy plant, which mimics the red blood of meat. All right, so talking about our olfactory receptors, and that we're talking about our nose and how we actually perceive the flavor of our food. Meat pairs with certain other chemicals in which they share chemical compounds. So for instance, pork works very well with paired with something sweet. That's why you have a pork chop with applesauce or with turnip or parsnips. They have that sweetness, and it's the gamma octolactone, which is a 5-sided structure. So we're talking about what kind of molecule is this? Right, it's a sugar molecule. So it has that sweetness, and it brings out the natural sweetness in the pork. Branched chain fatty acids and thymol, which is a phenol derived from thyme, pairs very well with lamb. So because they have the same chemical composition, thyme and lamb work really well together in addition. Now, inside the cooked meat, the cooking process, the proteins are denatured and coagulated. We obviously don't want them to curdle because we want to keep the juiciness and the rich mouth feeling of the fat within our meat. If we've fully cooked our meat, what ends up happening is we've really squeezed out all of the moisture. It's very firm and unyielding, and it doesn't have a nice mouth feel to it. Similarly, a meat that is barely cooked, like a black and blue steak in which the outside is just seared, almost raw, ice cold raw center, it has a very slippery, soft texture and might be a little bit off-putting if it's not cut into something really thin like a carpaccio or a tartare, in which case those muscle fibers are broken down in advance into very edible bite-sized pieces. Now, when you're making a steak or cooking a burger or doing any kind of meat cookery, you can tell how it's done by using your hand. So you will raise your palm, and you can see what raw meat feels like by just touching your loose hand right here on your fleshy part underneath your thumb. And if you put your first finger and your thumb together, this is what rare meat feels like. If we put our middle finger and thumb, this is medium rare. Medium is going to be your index finger and your thumb. And finally, well done meat is your pinky and your thumb. And the reason this works is we're actually contracting that muscle right here, and we're seeing what it feels like when the muscle contracts. So as the proteins within that meat are acted upon by the heat, they will contract, and that gives the stronger texture to them. So, obviously this is going to be a lot softer and fleshier if it's rare versus if it's, fully cooked. It has a lot more firmness to it. Now, one of the things that makes meat taste so delicious to us humans is this thing called the Maillard reaction. Maillard reaction, and it's named after a gentleman. It's not Maillard, it's Maillard. And what ends up happening is proteins and sugars get together and they recombine to form new delicious flavor molecules. And these giant brown polymers have delicious flavor. So they contain furans, nitrogen, different organic molecules, and they also contain glutamates. And glutamates, our mouth perceives as savory or rich. So if you've ever had a smash burger, right? A burger that they press on the grill and get that real dark, crispy, crunchy outside, what they're actually doing is creating a patty made of the Maillard reaction. So they're trying to get as much of a crust onto it as possible. Now, there are a couple parts of the Maillard reaction that are important. In order for it to happen, we must have a protein and a sugar. We must have high heat in the absence of water. So you can't have the Maillard reaction if you boil meat or if you cover your pot and allow steam to build up in there. You'll actually inhibit the Maillard reaction. So one of the chef's tricks that I can give you is if you're cooking meat, don't crowd the pan. When you crowd the pan, what you're doing is inhibiting the Maillard reaction by trapping moisture and trapping that steam in there with your meat. This seems like a good place to keep calm and recap. So let's talk about what we just learned about meat and go through some questions regarding it. So when we're talking about muscle fibers of land terrestrial animals that we include in our diets on a regular basis for most people or over time for many different peoples, we're talking about two kinds of meat. We have white meat and red meat. Which one of these is the fast twitch muscles? So which one of these kinds of meat reacts to quick bursts of energy and it pulls its energy sources not from oxygen, but from stored carbohydrates? Are we talking about white meat or red meat? That's right. Those fast twitch muscles are going to be the white meat muscles. Whereas the constant use, they need more constant oxygen, and those are going to be the red meat. Now, if you're going to a steakhouse and they slice your steak for you, they might be doing that for a very specific reason. They want to make sure that when you eat your steak, you have an optimal eating experience. And they're doing it to make sure. Why are they doing that? Why would a steakhouse cut your steak in advance? Are they trying to make sure that something happens? Can you explain to us why they would cut your steak in advance? They want to make sure that it's cut against the grain. So they want to make sure that those long muscle fibers are being cut against the grain, because they can do all the work of delivering you a beautiful steak, aging it, making sure that it's seared perfectly. And if you cut it with the grain, you've ruined all of their work. So they'll actually cut it for you so that you have an optimal eating experience. And finally, what reaction occurs when proteins, sugars get together over high heat? What is this reaction called? Right, the Maillard reaction. And why do we want the Maillard reaction to occur? What does it give us? Savory, mouth-filling flavors, right? The polymerization, these big brown pigments, whatever you want to write there, anything along those lines, I'll accept. Now, I think it's time to move on to our fish, aquatic animals. So we've talked about land terrestrial meat. Now it's time to talk about aquatic meat and how they differ. So the first thing that differs is that living in water affects the physical and chemical quality of an animal's flesh. So things like the skin. The skin is 2 layers thick. It has a thin epidermis and a thick epidermis. It's rich in lipids and connective tissue. Very high in collagen. It has scales, and those are reinforced by calcium. The bones of a fish are also going to be much smaller and lighter than land animal bones, and they can even be softened or dissolved in hot water. So oftentimes fish stock involves boiling the bones and the skin, and you leave the general flesh of the fish alone. Now, muscle fibers in fish are arranged in these sheets called myotomes, and they work a little bit differently than the muscle fibers in land animals. So in land animals where we have actin and myosin, which are causing the contraction of the muscle fibers, in fish, we're having more of a swaying motion back and forth. So these myotomes actually slide against each other, and that pulls the fish body in one direction and then in the other. So as they slide back and forth, the fish appears to move back and forth through the water, and that causes them to progress from one location to another. And this is important because in between each of those myotome sheaths, there's going to be collagen fibers running back from the backbone to the skin. And it has a lot less structure in reinforcing amino acids than beef collagen or other collagen found in land animals. So it is rendered at a much lower temperature. If you've ever cooked salmon or a very collagen-rich fish and seen like white stuff coming out of it, what that is actually the rendered collagen of the fish. Now, so the taste sensation of fish comes from the gelatin and the fat within the fish that give the impression of moistness. The belly region of the fish is usually the fattiest. So if we're talking here about tuna, we can see that different cuts of tuna are going to have different levels of fattiness, with the O'otoro being the belly region of the tuna, the most fatty part and the most prized. Now, fish flavor depends on where a fish is raised. So a fish from the sea is going to have a lot more tasty amino acids and amines than one that is raised in fresh water. And this is because they balance the saltiness of the seawater with these amino acids and amines, glycine and glutamate. And that gives them a lot more full tasting and a richer flavor. So depending on where you find your fish, it will have more or less of that rich flavor or more of a basic flavor, kind of not as much flavor. Now, if you walk into a fish market and it smells like fish, you should turn around and walk out of the fish market. It's really important that fresh fish not smell fishy. When that happens, what ends up happening is some of the molecules within the fish begin to break down. So bromophenols and trimethylamine oxide actually break down as the fish is decomposing, and this gives us a really unpleasant odor of the fish, very fishy and strong. So what should you look for in a fresh fish? You want the gills to be bright pink or red, no dark, murky red. You want the body to be firm and springy. It shouldn't be spongy or sticky at all. And you want it to smell clean and fresh. It should have a fresh ocean smell, almost like crushed leaves. Fresh, earthy, wet grass, not a unpleasantly fishy smell. If it accosts your face, it's not good. and the eyes should be bright and clear and plump. If they're cloudy or sunken, that's also the sign of an older fish, one that's beginning to decompose. And fish break down very quickly, and that's often why you find fish in the frozen section. So fresh fish are generally cleaned and quick frozen because their flesh does break down very quickly. So if you don't have the proper refrigeration, or if it's not held on ice, it can have a very off-putting flavor very quickly. And some of the colors of the fish come not only from the myoglobin, that heme group. Some have the red color, like a tuna, or salmon, or some of the trouts. And some have astaxanthins. Astaxanthins and beta carotene come from algae. And because these larger fish prey on crustaceans, which are rich in these astaxanthins, which feed on algae, they absorb those astaxanthins in higher quantities than even the crustaceans, taking on the orange appearance of color, which will only increase as they're cooked. Now, some of the repulsive odors of fish can actually be counteracted by antioxidants. Antioxidants like green tea, onion, bay, sage, clove, ginger, cardamom. Oh, we're listing the ingredients in Old Bay. Old Bay seasoning was actually developed not only because it pairs wonderfully with seafood and gives it a great flavor. Who doesn't love Old Bay seasoning? But because chemically, those antioxidants against the oxidation will preserve and combat some of the stronger flavors that come from fish. Now, the collagen in fish will collapse before coagulation, and that's why sometimes fish release a lot of fluid. So how fish are cooked will also impart the flavor of fish. And this is why oftentimes fish are cooked in a broth, or they're poached, or they're used in a sauce. And you're not looking for the Maillard reaction on your fish. Or if you are, you're doing a very high quick sear, and then you're letting it finish cooking in a different way, involving usually a broth or a stew or a soup, something that helps to reinforce those amino acids and also capture all that wonderful flavor from the collagen in the fish. Now, shellfish are a culinary term for exoskeleton-bearing aquatic invertebrate, and these refer to mollusks, crustaceans, and echinoderms, crustaceans being like shrimp, lobster, and crab. And these are going to be different because their body consists of two parts in a crustacean, the cephalothorax and the abdomen. And in shrimp specifically, the shell is made of chitin. And this chitin is a network of molecules that are a hybrid between carbohydrates and proteins. Now, as they're boiled, the proteins coagulate and they're released, giving us the amazing flavor of the crustaceans. So most of the flavor of shrimps and of most crustaceans is not in their protein-rich flesh, it's in their shell, which is why we cook lobsters in their shell. Why we make stock from lobster shells or shrimp shells. We make shrimp stock. So we use the bodies, the shells of these crustaceans where the chitin is to extract the flavor and give us that amazing quality. Now, again, we see astaxanthins. We talked about this, and this is one of the molecules that color the shell of the shrimp. So if you have a shrimp and it starts off as gray, and then it turns orange as you cook it, or a lobster that's gray or blue and turns red, what you're seeing are these carotenoid astaxanthins rising to the surface as the proteins begin to fold up. The astaxanthins escape, and the molecules change the color of the crustaceans. And finally, fish eggs. So another edible part of aquatic animals are their roe, or their eggs, We eat their eggs. If you've ever had sushi, you've had tobiko probably, those little orange dots on top of your sushi. That is fish eggs. Caviar is a delicacy. It comes specifically from a salt-cured fish egg of a wild sturgeon in the Caspian and Black Sea. It's one of the most expensive food products and the most rare. And it is usually eaten with a pearl spoon, a mother of pearl spoon. What's important is that the spoon is not reactive because of the acidity in the caviar. If it is a reactive spoon, meaning a metal spoon, it can cause off-putting flavors and a very less than desirable taste. So you can have a mother of pearl spoon, which, you know, itself costs hundreds of dollars, or you can just use a plastic spoon. Time for a recap. We learned about aquatic animals, and when we're talking about aquatic fish, what kind of fish are going to have a stronger, more earthy, and more rich flavor? Fish from the ocean or fish from fresh water? That's right, fish from the ocean. They have a much stronger, pleasing, glutamate-rich flavor because they fill their bodies with these tasty amines that counteract the seawater, whereas freshwater fish don't need to do that. Now, aquatic animals have different body structure than land animals. What are some of the differences in their bodies? When we talk about aquatic animals versus land animals, what are some of the differences in their bodies? Yeah, so the skin has a layer of fat right underneath it, which allows them to be buoyant and also repels water. And they have myotome sheets for their protein muscle fibers. So instead of having a filament or like a rope, they have these sheets that allow them to move, and they decompose faster. They have a higher level of collagen. Any of these answers, all of these answers, anything else we discussed during the lecture, great. And finally, what gives crustaceans their orange color? So if I boil a lobster and the lobster starts off as blue, why does the lobster turn red? What molecule is exposed as the proteins coagulate? Astaxanthins. The carotenoid astaxanthins gives the lobster its orange color. Correct. Any other questions that you have for me about this lecture or about our meat, land animals, aquatic animals, anything you don't understand that you need me to answer? Now's the time to ask it, and then we're gonna talk about your final term paper. Great. Now, for your term paper, I really want you to pick a topic that you're interested in. So you're gonna write an assignment this week. It needs to be one paragraph, what your topic for your term paper is going to be, and what you will explore through that topic. It can be anything relating to food and science that we haven't already covered. So you can't go in depth about eggs because we did a whole lecture on eggs. Pick something new. You can talk about anything that we have covered maybe or just touched on and you want to go deeper. So for instance, if you want to explore caviar and the wild world that is caviar and do a research paper into the different types of caviar and the caviar trade and the caviar usage in fine dining, you can definitely go there. But you have to pick something we haven't already explored in depth. Just talking about the Maillard reaction, not enough. Just talking about eggs, not enough. Pick something that you can research and get 3 at least full pages of solid research into food production. I will respond to your responses and approve or suggest something different or some changes. If you have any questions, you can reach me on my Google Voice number. It is listed on your syllabus and in the faculty information for myself, Christina Traore. or you can send me an email. I'm not as quick at responding to emails as I am at responding to texts on the Google Voice, but I will respond, especially if you are emailing about your term paper proposal. Your term paper must be approved for your topic, because I want to make sure that you get a good topic that has enough information that you can really dig into. So it has to be a good amount of information that you are able to acquire about this topic. So if you have any questions, again, you can write them here, or you can reach out to me on Google Voice or email. Email will take a little bit longer. Just be prepared. So thank you so much and have a great day. If you have any other questions about that, now is the time to ask them and I will respond to you. That's all for our lecture today. Have a great one. Bye.